welcome to this live reading from Lucky at Love by Cynthia Hamilton, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. I followed Judith Page into her office, the promise of yet another brilliant idea, my ticket to an audience with the editor-in-chief. It would be a bit much to classify this idea as brilliant, though I hadn't let that stop me from advertising it as such. "Let's hear it," she said as she closed the door behind me. I waited to speak until she had taken her seat, my loosely knit idea requiring her full attention, lest I start rambling on in a disjointed, incoherent manner. I was hoping once I started putting it into words, a whole cohesive storyline would emerge, thus satisfying Judith and easing my anxiety over what I wanted to embark on. It's a take on the notion of being addicted to love. As soon as I saw Judith's reaction, I knew I was out on a limb. I didn't want to give her the impression this was to be a soppy, romantic, swept-off-one's-feet piece. True, I did intend the story to be about love, or what passed for love in some people's minds, but it was the downside of romance that I was really angling for. I wanted to explore the hypothesis that some people are actually obsessed with falling in love, literally hooked on the thrill of new romance. I cleared my throat and pressed on. I met this guy at a wedding of all places who has been married and divorced 7 times. Judith's jaw dropped, but I could tell she was intrigued by the notion. 7 times? You think his story's legit? She asked. It was backed up by the bride's siblings. They had a gay old time teasing him about his numerous nuptials. I wish I'd had a tape recorder with me. It was quite a lively conversation on the subject of marriage and divorce, and rather irreverent considering where we were. In addition to the 7 brides, there have been countless live-in girlfriends. So what are you proposing? Write a piece about one man's obsession with marriage? That, but break it down. Find out what it was that attracted him to each of these women, and what compelled him to jump from one failed marriage to another, especially when there are men out there mortally afraid of getting married even once. I'd like to know why he thinks the relationships failed, and really, this is the angle that first caught my curiosity. What makes a woman take a chance on a guy who's been married 4, 5, 6 times before? You'd think they'd see a pattern there. I took a breath and gauged Judith's interest level. It seems to me there is some kind of mystique attached to a person who has been married so often, I continued, sensing I had caught her attention. Maybe it presents some kind of challenge to a woman, you know? If he only found the right person, he would be happy. The beginnings of a smile appeared on Judith's otherwise placid face. One woman volunteered to be wife number 8 right in front of her own husband. Needless to say, her husband was not amused. It just made me wonder what his many wives found so irresistible. Judith studied me for a moment. Are you thinking of interviewing some of these ex-wives as well? At this point, I couldn't tell if I had pushed the idea too far. I donned my best poker face and nodded. So, just how in-depth do you see this thing being? I mean, it is an interesting topic, but what is the real crux of your story? Is it this lover-man angle, or is it the man-woman attraction thing? I can see either having potential, but so far the way you're describing your concept is a little too nebulous. This was precisely my own worry. I smiled confidently and started tap dancing. The way I see it, the piece is twofold. It's about one man's choices and the motivation behind them. You can't really tackle his particular situation without taking a hard look at the man himself. And I don't think it's possible to accurately portray this Jake Sorensen character without the balancing perspective from the women who have shared his life for a while. His point of view versus theirs. Judith mulled over the concept. What I needed at this juncture was more proof of Jake's larger-than-life personality, but unfortunately the photo I had of this wild and woolly frontier man just wouldn't cast the right spell. I've got to tell you, Judith, this Jake is something else. You just wouldn't believe he was a Don Juan if you saw him. Why? Is he one of those shy, helpless guys that women feel sorry for? She asked, already losing her taste for the piece. Oh God, no, just the opposite. He's like a brick wall of a man, massively built with swagger galore. Not handsome per se, but he's got this irrepressible charm about him. Not the Cary Grant or Pierce Brosnan class of charm, more like raw animal magnetism. I had Judith's attention now. On top of being a ladies' man, he's also a decorated Vietnam vet. And he's been a nightclub owner, a Hollywood stuntman, antiques dealer, South American furniture importer. The list goes on. Now he's living on a 1,600-acre ranch in eastern Oregon where he breeds and trains mules. Mules, for God's sake. Judith laughed. What the hell does he do with them? I knew I had her now. He sells them for as much as a good quarter horse, I informed her with a derisive snort. No kidding. No kidding. He claims they're a better ride than a horse. Smoother. I let my eyebrows punctuate this remark. Judith swiveled back and forth in her chair. I could tell she was going to give me the go-ahead. She stood, and I stood. Jake Sorensen, Judith said, savoring the sound of it. I like the name. Rugged sounding. I assume you wouldn't be here if you hadn't already set up an interview with him. I smiled vaguely. He's ready, willing, and able. How old a guy is he? She asked as we walked toward her door, apparently tallying the countless women who had marked time in his life. Somewhere in his 50s, I'd say, but you'd never know it. I knew for a fact he was 62, but for some reason I felt compelled to lie. Okay, you get the goods on this Renaissance, Romeo. Settle the age-old conundrum of what attracts people to one another. But don't let this thing get too far flung. Email me a detailed memo with story outline and estimated travel expenses. I assume you plan to visit this man and maybe an ex-wife or two, she said, eyeing me deliberately. I want to see a rough draft no later than the end of October. I nodded obediently. This gave me just shy of a month to make something out of this cockamamie half-baked idea. Now all I had to do was inform my husband of my imminent travel plans, a chore I never looked forward to. Chapter 2. So I went ahead and booked a reservation on an 8 a.m. flight to Boise. His ranch is about a 4-hour drive south of there. Boise is actually closer than Portland, so that gives you an idea how remote he is. I said to Elliot the night before my departure as I dished out the salad and handed him the plates. I had just related his specially tailored version of my current project and the necessity of traveling to eastern Oregon to interview the rogue mule breeder we had met at our friend's wedding. In his customary distracted state, the project as I had outlined it so far had produced little more than the occasional assenting murmur. I had managed to give the plain, almost clinical essence of the piece, identifying what causes the insane optimism that leads some people into a string of disastrous relationships. In Jake's case, I was assuming they were disastrous, as not a single one had survived. Despite my careful phrasing, I could tell my husband wasn't listening to a word I'd said. As Elliot is a man consumed by modern technology and its inner workings, the trivial aspects of human caprices go largely unnoticed by him. My articles tend to focus almost entirely on what makes people tick, so I'm accustomed to his less than enthusiastic response to my writing inspirations. He is supportive of my work in the abstract, but his aloofness aside, something had apparently caught his attention, for he was now focused on the fact that I was headed out of town again. You're going to Oregon? He asked as the information belatedly registered. Yeah, to interview Miriam's brother, I reiterated patiently. You know, the guy who has a mule farm or whatever he called it. The light of recognition finally dawned in Elliot's eyes. Unfortunately, the light was quickly clouded over by confusion. Are you writing a piece about mules? He asked. I gave him the long-suffering look of a woman whose husband doesn't fully appreciate her career. Honey, you haven't heard anything I've been telling you for the last 10 minutes. Elliot paused in the middle of our pouring our waters, offended by my accusation mostly because it was true. Of course I have, he said hastily, but I just don't see the connection between that old coot and relationships, he said, triumphant in the fact that he had managed to recall another pertinent fact of what I had been telling him. You don't see the connection between relationships and a guy who has been married and divorced 7 times? I asked accusingly. Elliot looked sheepishly at me for a moment, then recovered. Oh, so you're focusing on the failed relationship angle. Nice try, I thought, barely able to keep the smile off my face. It didn't matter to me one whit that he was blasé about my writing, or in this project in particular. All I wanted was to take my little excursion without any static from him. In spite of his seemingly cold nature, he is surprisingly dependent on my company. Judging by his current level of guilt at having been caught ignoring my conversation once again, I didn't anticipate a whole lot of protest on his part. I sighed pointedly and handed him a bowl of pasta. "I'll just let you read it when it's finished," I told him. I picked up my bowl and water glass and headed to our tiny dining table, its only high point being the view of the Bay Bridge. This last statement generated a contrite appeal for more in-depth information. After a certain amount of obligatory pleading on his part, I relented and began to elaborate on the finer points I hoped to explore with our much-married acquaintance. True to form, Elliot quickly lost the thread of what I was saying, presumably more interested in his own professional challenges. Out of sheer orneriness, I continued my monologue, using this unique forum to think out loud and further hone my idea. I knew I would have plenty of time on the plane to outline my questions, but as I saw much potential in the topic of frenzied attraction resulting in repeated marriage and divorce, it helped enormously to bat the idea around in the open air. The more I indulged in this stream of consciousness, the more remote Elliot became, lulled into productive thought by my endless drone. Just out of spite, because I knew he wasn't listening, I told him I wasn't sure how long I would be gone. Maybe a day, maybe 3 or 4. The ticket was open-ended. This disclaimer produced not a sound out of him. Well, I had told him, and if my extended absence came as a shock to him later, I could truthfully say he had been advised of my uncertain plans. Goaded into an even feistier mood by his indifference, I told him that in addition to mules, Jake Sorensen also raised prize-winning elephants that he sold to the Chinese government to patrol the Great Wall, to which he responded with a pleasant, "I see." I sighed and took a long sip of my water. It was a damn good thing I'm the independent type, I consoled myself, or else I would be writing about failed marriages from first-hand experience. Elliot snapped back to reality as soon as I stopped speaking. He complimented me on the fettuccine, which he had gobbled down, and cleared the table, except for my glass. As I listened to the sounds of Elliot washing the dishes, I figured I was pretty lucky, all things considered, as undoubtedly there had to be a lot worse husbands out there than him.